In this tutorial, we are going to talk about the paper or subjects. So as you can see, under JSS1 exam, we have two papers, biology and paper 1. Paper 1 was imported from an external file. Okay, so we're going to see how the different properties of papers can be managed and set or configured. So first of all, the paper title. So we can decide to edit a paper as well as the description by right-clicking and clicking edit. Because papers are predefined nodes, you cannot edit them directly from the fields, just like you do for assessment. If you hover over this, you see to change title, go to manage subjects. So to edit a paper, all you just need to click is edit. And then you can decide that if you want to rename the paper or add a description, you can do that. We're good. So the next thing we'll do is paper code. Similarly, is a unique code to identify a paper. You can generate the code here, or you can choose whatever value suits you. That's unique. So we can also add an instructions for paper. So we also go to the other properties. Question type. So papers essentially are large containers that contains question groups as well as questions. And the paper can determine the kind of question. For example, there are about 4 question types. Multiple choice single select, popularly known as objective question. And you can select only one option as the correct option. Multiple choice multi-select is still objective, but it permits you to select one or more options as a correct option. Then fill in the blank allows you to fill in a blank during answering of the question, and theory question as well. So you can also have a mixed. So mixed means that this particular paper can have a mix of any one or more of these. So that's that about question types. So let's leave it at the default. I'm going to show you changing question types and how it affects the questions. Then we also have options count. So this is at paper level, you can set an option count as well as at question level or question node, you can set the option count. But what setting an option count at paper level does is that it ensures that new questions that are created, will have 5 or whatever was set. So if we say, let's set this to 5, subsequent questions will have 5. So we don't have to do that one after the other after we add questions. So number of questions simply shows the minimum number of questions for each group in that particular paper. So if we choose anything greater than the number of questions we have there, we're going to see an error. So it's more like a guardrail to tell us that we decided to have 10 questions, but we have only 9. We have to complete it. So it's a way for us to regulate us so that we don't end up adding 4 questions instead of 5. So topics is also another item we talked about during assessments. Remember, for each subject, there are topics associated with them. And topics are important in order for us to be able to group each questions into topic. Later on, we are going to see how, when we talk about questions, how we can assign questions to a topic, or how we can assign a topic to a question. And this is very important because it tells how the student performs for each topic. So assigning topics to question is a good way to know students' strengths or the topics they are most weak or strong at. So we're going to manage topics. So before we get back to topics, there's also sections arrangement. So similar to topics, section is a way to group questions into different parts. For example, comprehension in English language can be regarded as a section. It is still technically a topic, but usually English language or some other papers have large, broad divisions. And most times, these divisions need to be shown in sequence. Most English tests usually have comprehension passage come first. So a way for you to group questions into sections is to use the concept of section arrangement. So there's also going to be what we call sections. If I click at these settings here, you will see that there's only one section called the default section. So I'm going to come back to sections and topics later on. Then the next item is you can always expand the properties pane to view clearly. Show description and instruction before paper starts. So sometimes you want them to read the instructions and description. By default is yes. But for some reasons, if you don't want them to see that, perhaps they already know what to do. You can set that to false or no. Show score allotted to each question. So another way for you to take a test is you may want to show that, especially in cases where each question may not have equal mark, you want to show the scores associated with some questions. So difficult questions have higher marks allotted to them. So if you want that, you can click show show score allotted to each question. So by default, it is yes. But for some reasons, if you don't want them to see the scores for each question, you can make it no. Assign time to each question. So there are also some tests where the moment you navigate to, say, question 1, you see a timer counting down. That timer can be used to give the student a time to answer the question. It can be a very good way to prepare students' speed. For example, they may be preparing for Cowbellpedia challenge or competition, which is usually a test of time and accuracy. So a very good way to simulate that experience with our software is to allot time to each question. Yes. So when we pick yes, we have another property that appears and says duration per question in seconds. So let's say for each question, we want to give them 60 seconds. So what this means is if they navigate to a new question, they see a countdown timer immediately, counting down from 60 down to 0. The moment it reaches 0, it automatically moves to the next question. So if they fail to answer it, they automatically fail. So it can help them prepare and make sure. So this is like a default. So at the question level, you can still set the time for specific question. The default here means that for new questions, it will take the value of 60 seconds, but you can override it during question selection. For example, if you go to question, there's a new property now called question duration. So if you want question 1 to be 70 seconds or 120 seconds, you can do that. But if you add a new question to this, it will automatically assume that 60 seconds that was created under biology. So you can see it takes the 60 seconds. So the 60-second settings here is more like a default value. So it means that if you're adding new questions, by default it's 60. So it saves you the stress of having to assign question time duration to each question. Then we have total score. So how many do you want this biology paper to be? 100 is default. You can change it to 50, 400, or whatever you want. Allow negative scoring. Also, Venlearn software allows you to penalize people for failing questions. Again, this is a way to train them on accuracy, so they don't jump into answers without critical analysis and thinking. So for example, if I say by default is false, negative scoring is essentially if they get an answer wrongly, they're penalized for failing it. So instead of deducting 1 mark, which is equivalent to the mark they get when they get it right, you can say for every questions they get wrong, they lose 2 marks instead of 1. So it's a way to penalize them for inaccurate guesses or for guesses. So you can also simulate that with this software by selecting yes. So when you allow negative scoring, automatically the system has, for each question, it will deduct -1 mark. Usually, it shouldn't assign any mark from you, but when you fail it, -1 is deducted. But you can change that value. But the default, if you don't set these options, if allow negative scoring is no, it will not deduct any mark. It will just not assign any mark if you fail it. It means you got 0 there. So negative scoring penalizes people for getting a question wrong. So the system allows you to do that. So if you come to question now, you can see that it has a new field called negative scoring weight. This field appears because of the settings in the paper. So it means that for every question they get wrongly, their mark is deducted. Say you want to change it, you can decide that -2 marks instead of -1 will be deducted. So that's the essence of negative scoring settings. So let's leave it at the default. Allow negative scoring. Let's make it no. So we don't need to do that yet. Then calculator type. So sometimes you want to show calculator, especially for math-related subject. This is biology. It's not ideal to show calculator, but say it is math or physics or chemistry. There's a basic and scientific calculator. So if you choose basic, it will show a simple calculator. If you choose scientific, it will show a more advanced calculator for complex operations. None would not show any calculator at all. Then there's also candidates must select answers before the next questions. Also, we have seen some type of assessments that you are not able to navigate to the next question without selecting an answer. So it's also a way for us to simulate those kind of questions. So if you want them to make a selection before they can move next, you can choose yes. So candidates must select the right answer before the next question. Also, it doesn't stop at selecting an answer before they move. If you want them such that they must get it correctly, again, this can be used for training purpose. If they select wrongly, the system notifies them they got it wrong until they get the correct answer before they can move next. So this is also a way to train them. So if you want that option, you select yes. The next option is show answer and explanation before the next question. So if after selecting an answer, before they move next, if they get it right, they'll still see the answer and explanation. If they got it wrong, they'll still see it. It's also another way of simulating certain kind of assessment where you want them to see an answer before they practice. This is essentially or commonly used in practice situations, not in real exam situations. So we can leave it at default. Shuffle options. So there's also a way for you to shuffle options. So if you want user A and user B to have different option arrangement, you just pick shuffle option to be yes. Remember, you can always hover over each of the settings to know what they do. Question navigations flow is a way you order the question. Multi-page, meaning when they are seeing it on the client, they see one question per page, then they press next, they see one question at a time. Single page discrete is on a single page, but they scroll at one step for each question. For example, they can have the questions displayed as a list of items, a long vertical list. Then there's a next button. When they press next, it jumps to question 2. It jumps to question 3. It's discrete. They're in discrete steps. Those jumps are called discrete steps. But if it's continuous, they have to just scroll to the particular question they have. Then there's also another option called single page continuous. It's a single page, but it's not discrete. So there's no jumping to next question. You just have to scroll. So you are going to see the reason for these settings in, especially when we're talking about fill in the blank kind of question. So we'll come to that. So let's leave it at multi-page. It's most likely the default. Then the next option, again, most of these settings are paper. So at paper level, when they are done, they override all the questions. So questions derive those settings. Each question must have an explanation. So this is like a guardrail too, especially if you are giving people. So when you make it yes, it means that options field will throw an error. For example, if I say this should be yes, you discover that the number of questions, the number of errors have changed from 2 to 1. And now explanation is throwing an error because we have said all the questions must have an explanation. So it forces you to put an explanation for each question. This is also very useful if you are developing content in-house. So in our case, let's make that false because we are not interested in that. So each question must not have an explanation false. So it changes back to 1 error. So it's more like a check for us. So nothing serious. So each question must be assigned a difficulty level. Similarly, you can assign difficulty levels to each question. So if you want to enforce that, you pick yes or no. To us, it's not very necessary, so we'll disregard it. Each question must be assigned a section. So we're now going to talk about sections and topic. Then there's also what we call hide node. This is not very useful, especially as we are talking about assessments. It's more useful for library. Now, let's go to the sections and topics we talked about. Remember, I told you under biology, currently there are no topics. If we go to manage topics, you will discover that no topics are available under biology. If we also go to manage subjects, you can see that there are no topics. Hold on. Under manage subjects. Each of the subjects has 000 topics. Paper 1 has 5 because paper 1 was imported from an external project. Okay, so the external project, we had already assigned 5 topics, but the topics we created ourselves had 000 topics. So how we can add those topics? We can add for biology, we can decide to come and add the topics here, or we can do it through the paper, just as we instructed. So to do that, we click that. So you can see that biology currently has no topic. So to add a topic, you can say, first of all, cell is the first topic. You can add a description, it's optional. And let's say the second topic is ecology. So in a similar way, you can move up and move down. You can edit, you can delete a topic, you can add a new topic, just like we did for subject. So we'll skip that. So at this point now, we see now that for biology, we have 2 topics assigned. If you want to confirm that, if you go to assessment and go to manage subject, you can see that biology now has 2 topics. So we can add more topics if we want, but we'll see the usefulness of these topics when we are talking with questions. So we can now assign a question to a particular topic because we have assigned topic on that. For example, if you go to question 1 now, there's a place where we have question topic. So you can now see the 2 topics we have created. If we hadn't created those topics would not have appeared here. But when we're talking about questions, we'll talk about how to assign topics to questions. We'll leave that for now. So the next thing we are going to do is sections. Remember, I told you a section is a way to group questions. Sections are necessarily not topics, but they may have an overlap at some times. A good example is for English language. So for example, now, if you click on the settings under section, you discover that by default, every question belongs to a section. That's why the 4 questions we have here, they are default sections. So no matter how many questions you created, they must belong to the default section. But you may want to have custom sections. You can edit a section, but you cannot delete the default. Okay, you can actually delete the default section. Yeah, you can. So for example, if you want to add a new section, and you want to say, for example, this is comprehension. Let's say this is English language. And where this thing applies more, if you add a comprehension. So sequential flow here now. So remember, we talked about shuffling options. What about shuffling questions? So this is where it comes in. So it means every question associated with this comprehension topic, if we want it to be shuffled, we can put randomized or sequential. Sequential means it will appear as we type it. Question 1 is question 1, question 2 is question 2, everywhere. Randomized means that it will be at random. So every question assigned under, so let's say comprehension has 2 questions or 4 questions. When we are, if we choose randomized, it means that the comprehension questions for user A may be differently arranged from that of user B. So that's what it means here. Then we can add an optional description, but at this point we are good. So we have added comprehension. However, there are no subjects, there are no question associated with it. So in order to assign questions to comprehension, we can come here. Let's say question 1, we want it to have, so by default, it has a default section. So we can cancel the default and put the comprehension. So let's say question 1, question 2, and question 3 has the default, the comprehension assignment. So let's do that for question 3. So we'll talk more about that. So if we now come back to manage sections, you can now see that comprehension now has three questions associated with it. Now, those 3 questions now, they are sequential, meaning that they appear as it is. But let's say we want it to be random whenever, so before I talk about it, section itself can be rearranged. So the essence of this sectioning is, for example, if we decide to shuffle all the questions in English language, sometimes comprehension may appear as subsequent questions. And many times English is structured in such a way that comprehension must come first. So one way to ensure that even while we shuffle the option is to use the concept of sectioning. Even while we shuffle the questions, is to use the concept of sectioning. With sectioning, we can ensure that comprehension appears first. So for example, if we move this comprehension first, we move it up. Now comprehension is the first item. Now we want to make sure that comprehension must appear before any other section. So the arrangements there should be what? Sequential. If we randomize it, it means that comprehension can appear after the default section, or after, if we have multiple sections, it can appear in between anywhere. So what this sequential ensures is that the comprehension will come first, but then inside comprehension, we can decide to randomize the questions under comprehension. So a good way to randomize questions is not just by saying all the questions should be random. If we do that, it means comprehension can appear in question 30, and sometimes we don't want that. So what we have to do is to edit it and say comprehension will be sequential in terms of the section arrangement, but under the section, the questions under that section will be randomized. So we can put the question under comprehension to be random. So we can randomize it, the comprehension. I think there's a bug. So we can randomize the comprehension. Let me edit this back so that it will be normal. So we can randomize the questions under comprehension. However, comprehension will still appear first because the arrangement here is sequential. If we decide to randomize this, what it means is that we are both randomizing the section arrangement as well as the questions inside the section. So it's more like a full randomization. So again, I would come again. The essence of randomization, section arrangement, is to arrange different parts of the question into different sections, such that we are sure that comprehension can appear first, or section 1 can appear first, section 2 appear next. Because sometimes the logical order of section is important, depends on the type of quiz. But if we don't want to regard the section, we don't even need to assign them to section. All we just need to do is to just leave everything as random. So if we want to randomize it, we just come and randomize the default section here. So we can say edit and let the default be random, right? So when we randomize it, we can change the settings. So I think there's a bit of a bug. We need to be able to submit it. So we'll look at that. So that's how it works. So sectioning essentially allows us to arrange questions into different parts, such that we can determine that the parts appear in order. For example, we can have comprehension, lexis, and structure, and so on and so forth. If we want them to appear in sequence, we can create different sections for them and make sure that the arrangement for that paper section is in sequential. However, in each of these sections, if we want the questions inside them to be random, we make sure we change the settings by clicking on edit and choosing randomized. So that's how it works. So with this, we can ensure that questions appear in hierarchy, sections appear in hierarchy, and then we can randomize them. So two users, even if they are studying comprehension, they have different questions at different time. So that's that about the properties of paper. Also, paper also have other options. So we can add a question group under a paper, just like we have created before. Add paper next to this, we talked about it. So if we want to add paper immediately after biology, we can choose the paper here, we can create a new paper or a subject. The edit, the copy, cuts, duplicates, deletes, and preview work in the same way. Also, we can export questions as PDF, Word document, Excel, or CSV file. We can also import a question group, just like we did import a paper when we were talking about assessment. We can also import another question group from another project. We do that, we can select the project, and then you can select it. So let's say the same video samples we chose. So this time we'll be able to select only question group. So remember, the first time we did it, we were able to select papers, but now we can select question group because we're already trying to add groups under a paper. So you can select any of these and then to add it. So I'm going to skip that so I don't corrupt my file. So at this point, we have just talked about papers. We talked about the properties of papers and the various things that can be done on paper. In the next tutorial, we're going to talk about questions and question groups. Thank you.